All right. Let's see. Well, so welcome, Colorado Realtors, to our local issues panel. I see a lot of folks are getting on right now. Just in case you're wondering, this is a webinar, so it'll look a little different than all your other Zoom meetings. You won't see your own face or any of that. It's just going to be me and our panelists. You should be seeing my screen right now with our PowerPoint. But again, welcome to our RPAC month local issues panel. We're super excited that you guys can all join us. And we have some awesome and really interesting topics to discuss today. So I'm gonna go ahead and, but actually before we jump into that, the reason we're doing this, we wanna bring you this awesome content, but also we are in the middle or towards the end of RPAC month. So we've been celebrating all through the month of July. And, one of the things we're doing is we are doing a diamond drawing, which many of you guys have seen through our emails and stuff. But if you are interested in entering that diamond drawing, it is $25 per ticket, and you could win a $2,000 diamond, real diamond, that we will get delivered to you after the drawing, which is on July 31st, on Friday. So I will have information on how to invest in that. But please sit back and enjoy this local issues panel. And I will go ahead and introduce our moderator and our panelists. Also, we do want you guys to be able to ask questions or anything like that. So during the panel, if you do have questions, please enter those into the chat, not the Q&A. So you'll see that there's a Q&A and a chat. If you type a question into the chat, it will show up to all of our panelists here, and we'll try to answer some of those questions as we go. So let's go ahead and introduce our moderator and our panelists. So joining us here to moderate this discussion is Nick Pacone. He is a local government affairs director for the South Metro Denver Realtor Association, as well as Aspen Board of Realtors and the Steamboat Springs Board of Realtors, and he will be moderating our conversation today. Thanks, Nick. And our panelists here, we have Peter Wall, who is the Government Affairs Director for the Denver Metro Association of Realtors. And we have Clarissa Thomas, who's the Government Affairs Director for the Pikes Peak Association of Realtors. And we have Barbara Kelzer, who is the Government Affairs Director for Greeley Association of Realtors, Longmont Association of Realtors, Loveland Berthoud Association of Realtors, Fort Collins Board of Realtors, and the Boulder Area Association of Realtors. So welcome to all of our panelists and our moderator. Thank you all for being here, and I will go ahead and turn it over to you, Nick.
Sounds great. Thank you, Cameron, so much for the introduction. Thanks to all of you for joining us on this call/webinar today. And I'm honored to serve on a panel with three of the colleagues around the state of Colorado who I've already learned so much from. I get to lean on them for advice, for experience, for ideas, and all of us work as hard as we can to do the best work possible for our members of realtor associations across the state. So we've got some good questions today from my panelists and my colleagues, and I'm just gonna get right into it. But like Cameron said, folks on the call, if there is something that you wanna see addressed, if we have time for it, put it in the chat. We'll all be monitoring it, and we'll insert it when it's appropriate. So, of my panelists, Barb, I'll come to you first, but this is for all three of my colleagues. We're going to do a little bit of looking at some of our general issues that we care about, what's going on right now, as well as looking back on the COVID pandemic, which we're still in, as well as some future crystal balling. So on one of the big issues that we all care about across the state, Barb, there's a lack of affordable housing inventory across Colorado. What are some innovative ways to address this issue that you've seen that you are particularly drawn to? Is it about better zoning laws? Is it about looking at accessory dwelling units in a better or different light? Or what are some of the good things that you've seen going on so far?
We've looked at all of those things that you mentioned, Nick. In my associations, Boulder's been working on ADU regulations for a long time. They have one of the oldest and, in my personal opinion, most onerous inclusionary housing requirements. I really like the idea of looking at zoning regulations and how to change those lot size. We have an advocacy group in Northern Colorado called NoCo Housing Now, and that's a group of people from real estate, from the public sector, other private sectors. We're researching all sorts of different avenues, and those are some of the things that we really think would make a difference, you know, but unfortunately none of them are simple, right? Case in point, density. Everybody says we need more housing, but we don't want it in my neighborhood, put it somewhere else. Or people just say our town is crowded enough. We don't want to see more units. We don't like density. We don't want it in this or that neighborhood. And that's where it gets tricky trying to build consensus. But all of those things I think are really important and will continue to be important moving forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it'll be interesting too to see if people across the state look at the word or the definition of density differently in the putting it up with the being magnified by the COVID crisis. You know, is
yeah,
it
we'll talk about that. I think in some of our questions and some of the scary things I'm already hearing about density and how that can be used as a strategy to prevent affordable housing.
Absolutely. Peter, you work in an urban environment as well as suburban and have some members that sell some land as well. How about from your perspective? Same question.
Yeah, so we've, a few years ago, City and County of Denver established a dedicated funding stream for affordable housing. We spent years and years and years debating about the funding sources, one of which comes from a dedicated property tax mill levy, although we worked to decrease that mill levy so we weren't going to cost burden existing homeowners to pay for new ones. And then part of that impact fee, affordable housing fee, comes from an impact fee on new residential and commercial development. Again, one of the fights that we had to have was not actually having an impact fee on residential that was going to be too high to make new residential development cost prohibitive, particularly on the attached housing condominium side. We obviously didn't have enough of those in the market. We wanted to see more of them, given that they're a stepping stone in home ownership. So long and short of it, I think there's ways that you can look at funding sources to create these dedicated funding streams. But then it's really up to the local governments to partner with housing authorities and other experts, and frankly, the private sector, to figure out ways that they can actually get these units built. It's always, a fact that it's cheaper to actually, partner with the private sector to create affordability in a unit that already exists, rather than build a new unit altogether. The cost of construction, labor has made housing, as we all know, extremely expensive. So I think, that's one strategy for sure. I saw in the questionnaire prompt, there's a question about, height incentives. A couple of years ago, near one of our transit stops, 38th and Blake, the city went through, again, a couple of year-long processes to talk about a height incentive whereby a developer, if they were going to build a certain percentage of affordable housing within a project, could get some additional height for a project. So that's been implemented at 38th and Blake. Some developers are taking advantage of that, some are not. You will certainly see over the coming years a push to go back and look at zoning codes, particularly given the prominence of the Black Lives Matter movement. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. I mean, housing policy has been nothing but discriminatory over the past 60, 70, 80 years. There are ways that we can sit there and adjust our zoning codes, our comprehensive plans, and other planning documents to address some of those inequities that housing policy has created. The City and County of Denver is going to start a probably 2-3 year long process to look at that. But to Barb's point, there's a lot of folks that talk about inclusivity and how they want to sit there and be inclusive to populations that they've disenfranchised. But when push comes to shove, we'll see where they put their money where their mouth is, when some of that density is going to have to be in their backyard. It's going to be a difficult, tough conversation. The last thing I'll mention is just we're looking at a handful of cities updating their group living standards I don't cover Aurora, but I know Aurora is working on their group living standards. Denver's been working on their group living standards. And this is, you know, how many unrelated individuals can live in a home together. Certainly more important than ever during COVID, when you're going to have significant amount of people without jobs. People are going to be losing their homes, and we want to provide them with flexible options to get into their homes, but also be cognizant of not changing some of our more stable single-family neighborhoods.
Absolutely. It'll be interesting to see how some of our college towns around the state will be dealing with that issue as well, since they've, you know, I don't want to generalize, but have historically tried to limit those unrelated people numbers in homes. So there is a new opportunity to look at all of these things with a new light, and a light that embraces equality and the things that Peter mentioned. Clarissa, how about you? Same question, same ideas. What are some of the good things?
Well, at PPAR, one of the issues that we've been finally looking at for, I'm going to say probably dating back since 2016, is the expansion of auxiliary dwelling units. And we had that in Colorado Springs since 2003. They had a distinction that it was accessory dwelling suites were eligible to be done and included in a single family home, and mostly like in-law suites. Well, over the course of from 2003, I would say probably till about 2015, there was a lot of dialogue and trying to figure out how affordable housing would start going and crossing the boundaries of maybe more attainable housing, and changing also the character of neighborhoods to be more conforming with this new plan that was happening and taking place in Colorado Springs called Plan COS. So when the consultants that were hired to bring in this project and this proposal to the city of Colorado Springs developed this comprehensive new plan for the city, one of the things was that in redefining what neighborhoods and the character of neighborhoods is that accessory dwelling units would actually take a bigger role in how housing attainability and affordability was taking place. PPAR was not very happy with the way that it was proposed at the beginning, because that Plan COS really was redefining what neighborhoods were all about. It was more of a mandate, and I say that loosely, but it was more telling people this is what you're going to do without really thinking of the consequences. So at the beginning, we as an association were a little bit hesitant to accept the newfound proposal for accessory dwelling units. And the way that it evolved, and I say this because at the beginning, they were coming up with something to the effect of, it doesn't matter what your private property rights are. If we decide that it conforms to the character, we're going to allow for this to be built if somebody else decides to purchase the land and it's what we like. And it's like, well, who's we, and why would you violate somebody else's private property rights, even if it's in the name of housing affordability or housing attainability? Whatever happened to a neighborhood and the characteristics of that neighborhood? So again, I say PPAR was a little bit hesitant to just jump on the bandwagon of accessory dwelling units as they were being proposed. And so in the course between 2016, 2017, 2018, as this Plan COS started developing and being formulated, and now it's been implemented, ADUs took a different character. And of course, we also had elections, and the city council changed a little bit in its dynamics. And so some of the new council members that came in 2018 and 2019 have taken a different approach, because they started understanding that you just can't, even if it feels good, you just can't come in and take somebody else's private property rights in the name of common good. So the way that accessory dwelling units were just approved in 3 separate ordinances in Colorado Springs earlier in June. Actually, the first reading was early June, and the later part of June was the final approval. But what it takes is it modifies and it expands. So modifies what was currently in place with accessory dwelling suites, and then it expands it to also allow for attached and detached in-law suites, if you want to still call it that. But they have to be conforming to the character of a neighborhood. They have to involve, and this is where we stepped in and said, we really encourage city council and planning staff to provide the community almost like a public awareness campaign to say, this is how the character of your neighborhood is going to change if an accessory dwelling unit is going to be proposed. And, you know, those of us that are enthralled in this process understand what it means. But the common Joe in a neighborhood is not going to know what the change of a character of a neighborhood is going to be. So a couple of the council members ended up agreeing with our position that we do want an education campaign to tell people this is how this changing in code and ordinances are going to affect the character of your street or the character of the neighborhood as a whole, but there's still a very rigorous approval process. And so for the most part, it's allowing people to be able to do multi-generational housing, and say that you want to bring in like your grandma, or maybe your kids are, you know, young newlywed couple, and you want to help them out, and you want to build an attached dwelling unit or a detached, as long as it fits with that plan within a neighborhood, then you're able to do that. So we felt when it was all said and done, that the character of our community is still being preserved, and yet allowing people to be able to do some additions within, you know, that attainable housing structure, and also housing affordability, depending on what those price points are. But not only that, when it comes to housing affordability, Mayor Suthers, who's obviously in his second term, because our industry has supported him for, you know, his second cycle and the first run at the mill in Colorado Springs, but he was very committed to addressing housing affordability in Colorado Springs. And in 2015, he challenged community members to say, we, in the course of, actually, I take it back. He started talking about it in 2015. By 2017, 2018, he rolled out a plan that said, for the next 5 years, we're challenging you as a community to look at ways, whether it's through incentives, whether it's through community partnerships, public, private, that we work on 1,000 units of housing affordability in the city of Colorado Springs. And those, of course, are that no more than 30% of a household income gets allocated towards housing. And so this is where we are. This is where Colorado Springs is. And what we're seeing is, even within the downtown, you know, corridor, is that every single time there's some new project coming into the fray, the developing community within Colorado Springs is very earnest at making sure that that balance is being struck. And so little by little, we're working towards having more units allocated towards that housing affordability price point. And the final component is, the mayor has been very aggressive and very adamant about saying that he wants these things to happen in order to balance our community to not only thrive economically, but to be able to do access points of entry for the young millennial community that might want to stay in Colorado Springs, but might not be able to afford some of the higher, you know, price points that we have. And as you have all seen, Colorado Springs, you know, keeps growing, which, you know, it's a give and take. You know, we grow, but if we're not addressing those needs, then our community as a whole is going to suffer, because we can't have housing units for the people that meet that price point for entry level.
Absolutely. So for the panelists or for the attendees on the call, we had 3 parts to this question: the good things that you've seen so far, the bad things that you've seen so far, and how things are changing in a COVID environment. True to form with the experts on the panel, I feel like you've each touched on little bits of those all together. So in the interest of moving on, I will ask you to summarize on this topic either something a trend that you are not happy with seeing going forward, or something of note that has changed in this COVID environment in the way that our elected officials are looking at affordable housing. And like I said, you've all kind of touched on this a little bit, so it'll be your choice. Peter, do you have any thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I think, to focus on the positive, I do think, we're optimistic that given the prevalence of the Black Lives Matter movement right now, that will serve as a strong catalyst to really look at more equitable housing policy, particularly as it pertains to zoning. There are ways that you can focus density and create density in neighborhoods without changing the character of those neighborhoods. It's anything from accessory dwelling units to duplexes, to tri and fourplexes on corner lots and some of these larger lots. And it's a tough conversation, but it's one that needs to be had. We certainly have a progressive council that has gotten behind that movement. So we're optimistic that they're going to be more open to exploring some policy changes that are needed there. I think the other most important, policy change that we're going to see is probably more of an emphasis on home ownership rather than just housing in general. I think a lot of times when we're looking at the language in, our guiding documents, whether it's a Blueprint Denver or a comprehensive plan Denver, there's a lot of general language that focuses on housing, and we push hard to sit there and also focus on home ownership, particularly as a way to protect against gentrification. I mean, there was an article that came out the other day that talked about Denver being the #2 gentrifying city in the entire country. The only way that you sit there and actually provide some certainty from homeowners that the rent's not going to go up and they're not going to be kicked out when a developer buys a property and it turns over is to actually have them be the homeowners themselves and control their destiny. So I think if we can use this movement as a stepping stone to sit there and change some of those policies and put more emphasis on home ownership, that's going to hopefully reduce gentrification, help with it, but also allow us to create some additional affordability with some of that quiet density.
Peter, always keeping it positive. Thank you for that. Barb and Clarissa, either one of you, either of those last two topics, whoever wants to go first is fine with me. Unmute yourself, though, if you are talking.
I had to unmute myself. Sorry about that. I teased it up, so I feel like I should mention something that I'm worried about, even though I like to be positive, but frankly, when you're dealing with elected officials, I don't feel we can always be as positive as I would like, because some of them have some wacky ideas and some of their constituents do. The thing that I mentioned briefly, I am already hearing environmental activists get up and speak in front of various city councils saying that clearly density has exacerbated the COVID crisis, and therefore they should consider less dense developments moving forward. Now, that will never help affordability on any end of the scale. And I think they're using that as an excuse to perhaps, slow growth down, which is certainly not. My members need new housing developments because the demand is so great for inventory. So using COVID as an excuse to make development less dense will just make it less affordable. And I think it's not necessarily a very, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a self-serving argument on their part. And I worry about them trying to use that, and elected officials saying, wow, that's true. What are we going to do? Too many people spreads COVID. This won't be the last epidemic we face. So that will just hurt affordability efforts everywhere.
Nick, if I could just jump before Clarissa goes, if I could just jump in there, Barb, we're hearing that too. I think the irony in what you just brought up is you said, you're hearing this from some, I believe you said environmental activists. And the reality is the densest developments are the ones that are most environmentally efficient and the ones that have the least impact on the environment. When you're pushing sprawl, that creates a significant impact on the environment, particularly when you're forcing people into their vehicle and they're driving farther to actually get to where they work and play. So I like to always throw out that argument to go back and kind of call out the hypocrisy of some of those anti-densification arguments, particularly from that core of folks.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a great point. Clarissa?
Well, what I was going to say in regards to, it's not so much the negativity on this, but excessive regulation or an excessive regulatory environment, I think is still the biggest point of contention for us. Because while we have in the city of Colorado Springs and in El Paso County, we have very noble quests to be able to build more, whether it's single unit housing or multi-unit housing. We've got so many regulatory burdens, and people still have concerns about construction defects. So there has to be a workaround. And I know that at the car level, our LPC keeps pushing back on any modifications to that construction defects. But when I talk about, our apple pie right now about how it's great that Colorado Springs has really taken, very aggressive stance with the leadership that it has to work in addressing attainability and affordability. We have so much work to still be done because of the regulatory structure that puts a damper on things. So you might have, funding issues that some developers can't tap into funding for multifamily units. And you might have builders that are still dealing with either if it's increased price, price of construction, et cetera, et cetera. So there's so many other things that are just not, they're factors that we can't control. So we could talk about saying what Colorado Springs is and wants to do, but sometimes that's where I say, well, the downside is that a lot of it is aspirational. And then another point of contention too is that while we feel that it's great that this is the path that we're all, in leading towards, it's still very complicated when, the climate changes, whether it's economic or it's political. And so we've got a council that right now, for the most part, really do come into terms with saying that, oh, this sounds really good. And then when they have to actually vote on something, because they have to do a first reading and then an official vote. And it's how much the power of advocacy can affect the change. And so from PPAR's perspective, we know that sometimes we can't say no to things, and it's mostly how we can just amend. And it's even to the same status as what LPC has been doing. So we know that the train left the station, right? And it's, okay, what is PPR going to do now to make sure that we don't come across as always saying no, but let's go ahead and work on a couple of different things to make sure that the horizon looks better for our property owners. Because for us, it's not so much about the realtor perspective, it's about the homeowner perspective. And so that's how we have been working on things to make sure that whatever we work on council, we're voicing realtors as the advocates of homeowners. And that has almost pivoted our discussion with city elected leadership to make sure that we don't look as, just greedy real estate people. We look at, hey, we're here to protect the private property rights of the consumer. And we don't tell them, we don't like this because you guys are, like totally off your rocker. We just say, please don't do this to affect home ownership, and please don't do this to dampen the spirit of the dream of home ownership for X, Y, and Z. And so even in the brief period of time that we've been advocating for certain positions, I don't think it's been so much as no, as I'm falling in the Peter landscape, that I'm trying to see it from the glass half full as opposed to half empty, because we can't always just say no to things. And a lot of these things, because of the political climate in Colorado Springs, it's people wanting new ideas. And we've got a couple of council members that really are enamored with policies out of California. And so we have to try to diffuse their
Sure.
mentality that what happens in Oakland and what happens in San Francisco is really great, because they've gone to conferences there, they've traveled there, and we're like, okay, but you don't live there, and this is not California, so knock that nonsense off. We have to look at it from the perspective of what El Paso County, Colorado does, and how Colorado Springs wants to attract a livable, sustainable community. And so that is where I say that it's more Pollyanna-ish, but we try to do things more positively, and we're slowly getting there. But I think PPAR we're moving in a better direction than we felt we were in a couple of years past.
I think you can see we can all talk for about 2 hours on this topic. I'm going to take a little moderator liberty and move on to some of the other topics that we want to get to around the state. There are some great comments and questions in chat. My suggestion, Cameron, is we might be scheduling some more of these in the future that just cover this topic and some of the ones related to it. So thank you, panelists, for your thoughtful answers on this. But I want to move into some of the stuff that we just went through in these last 4 months and might still be going through. Our members' livelihood was strangled by this pandemic and by, various versions of reactions from a governmental perspective to it. And I don't want to draw any conclusions on what was or was not a good idea for our elected officials. But my question is, how did you and your association protect our members? How were you able to advocate during the ever-changing nature of this COVID environment? So I'd like to start with Peter first. I'll go Peter, Clarissa, and Barb, if that's okay.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, crazy time that I never thought I'd be thinking about what would be included and not included within a safer at home order. It's not in the lobbying 101 handbook of many issues that come up for us. Certainly I think probably a week or two, maybe a week before we saw the safer at home order come out in Denver, because I think we were the first one that probably had one, started to think about what would be included and not included. And obviously, there's many different industries, and everyone was going to be fighting for their industry to be included as an essential service within the safer at home. So long and short answer to your question, Nick, I had started conversations with the city and county of Denver about a week prior to that safer at home order coming out, knew it was going to be coming out around 10 o'clock that Monday morning. And for all intents and purposes, felt good about real estate services being included within that safer at home order. Obviously, there's a million different professions that they have within there. So needless to say, I was a little miffed when that order first came out at 10 o'clock and real estate was not deemed as essential in there. I think that was a mistake and an oversight. And after talking to the administration, it was, because they sent out a revised safer at home order around 3:30 that same day. And I worked with them as soon as the 10 o'clock order came out and it wasn't in there, to get real estate services clearly included within that 3:30 revised order. So I think that was a big win for us and for our association. Certainly the work didn't stop there, though. Denver led the way, but then you had Jefferson County Health. And then you had Tri-County Health, which covers Adams County, Arapahoe, and Douglas counties, all come out. And I had to, sit there and work with those elected officials within each of those counties to then go lobby their public health officials, because they obviously weren't the decision makers within those counties, to say real estate services needs to be included as essential as well. So we worked with those elected officials to work with their public health department officials to include real estate as an essential service. And then continued, we had that, kind of strange period there where then Carr had to take over because the state came out with that safer at home order, and that trumped the locals. And then, subsequently you had some local orders that ended up potentially being more restrictive than the states. So you just had to make sure that those local safer at home orders weren't going to be more restrictive and obviously, take out some of the most essential components of a real estate transaction. So long and short of it is, we fought tooth and nail to make sure that you guys continue to do your business. Was it perfect? No. Did I think we do a pretty darn good job across the state, both Carr and the local GADs to make sure you guys could operate? For sure. But it was definitely a tough one in uncharted territory for us.
Yeah. Absolutely. And Clarissa and Barb, as we come to you, what Peter mentioned was the thing that was brand new for me. All these years that we've been involved in advocacy for the Realtors, this is the first time I was lobbying elected officials to get to unelected officials. And it was, like Peter said, that wasn't in the handbook for me. So what do you two think?
Right. Well, I mean, at least from the local public policy perspective, I felt very fortunate that PPAR has been very active in its community involvement. And when I say that, it's one thing to just operate within the realtor structure. But for years, PPAR has worked on having relationships with local elected officials, whether it's city council, whether it's your regional building department, the assessor, school boards, including public health officials. And when I'm talking about the power of relationships, I think that this was it. Here we are looking at how an industry, and I'm not saying that we weren't sweating it. Of course we were sweating it, but it was automatically when we started hearing the stuff, it's like, I started texting people and I'm like, just make sure that whatever you do, you're protecting realtors, okay? I mean, and it was kind of funny. I'm like, I'm not trying to come across as self-serving, but make sure that you're not doing anything that's going to impact one of the biggest engines in our economy. And it was tongue in cheek with some people because I'm like, hey, just remember us, right? But at the end of the day, Colorado Springs and El Paso County Health, and all of these folks, including El Paso County commissioners, I don't want to say that they were lackadaisical because our El Paso County Public Health Department has been on top of it. And they've been briefing both the city and the county regularly. It was just more a matter of we are going to wait and see what happens at the state level. So rest assured, we're not going to infringe in a local level in any capacity. So let's just wait and see what the state does, and then we'll figure. So we had already heard from, early on that Mayor Suthers and the Board of County Commissioners were not going to do anything to shut down the city of Colorado Springs or do any restrictions in place. It was pretty much until the state ended up rolling that out. And it's like, well, I'm not saying that the ball got passed onto, CAR, but at least for the time being, PPAR was very comfortable that our territory, El Paso and Teller County, were protected because between those governing authorities, everybody was in sync. And so they said, we're not going to take measures to close things down. We're going to wait and see what the state does. And so with that, it certainly made my activities a lot easier until that meeting. I think we were all of us were being briefed by Liz. And I think it was Peter that said, hey, guys, am I misreading this? But real estate is not essential. And I think that we were all floored when that happened because we're like, scramble. I mean, we are going to have members freaking out if real estate is not essential. And I can't even say what it would have been like to be in Peter's shoes. I don't know what Barb's capacity and what it was if your respective governing authorities, closed you guys down. But I didn't have to worry about our folks doing that because the state ended up doing it. And then all of a sudden, everything became about CAR, making sure that they kept us in the loop. And it was great to have, for years, we used to have a lot more, I'm not sure if this is going to be crisis management, crisis mode of legislative activity, because we've never been in this position, but it was very, I think, commendable for how Liz and team ended up sharing all the information that was coming down to keep the local guys in the loop, for us to be able to make sure that our realtor members knew, that the work was being done to make sure that real estate was essential. So that right there was, something unprecedented. And if we had to do and go through this exercise again, which I hope we don't, I would love to give CAR the heads up that do it again like that, please, because it was great for all of us. And just the amount of interaction that even Liz responding to text messages at all hours was wonderful. So I'm not saying that.
Oh, we might have lost
Uh-oh.
there. And that's all right. As she reboots, Barb, what was it like fighting for our members from your perspective?
Well, it was a little crazy up here in some ways. First, I would be remiss if I didn't say how much I really, really appreciate the staff at CAR, both the Government Affairs Division and Scott Peterson and the legal team were so helpful to us in clarifying things that were essentially not very clear to begin with. And my counties mostly followed the state guidelines, so that made it easier. But when you got into the nitty-gritty, it was different at each and every county. And trying to explain the different regulations and the, those differences between Boulder County and Weld County and Larimer, there are still some little differences that are important to them, but not to our members, because our members work across county lines. And just because Larimer County, for example, requires approval to hold open houses doesn't mean that a realtor in Greeley knows that. And so I worked really closely with the CEOs from all the associations. We interacted a lot with public health officials. I never thought my previous work in Aspen and Pitkin County would come into play working in the environmental health department, but it did. And it's still a little crazy, but our people are working, they're selling homes, they're able to go on with their business regardless. And I'm just grateful that all of our elected and appointed officials have helped make that happen.
Yeah, Cameron's going to tie this together with an RPAC question for all of us at the end of this thing. But this is one of those points that I think should resonate with our members, not only the rest of this year, but throughout. This is where I believe associations proved to our membership the value of membership dollars.
Yes.
Because I have lots of friends that are not in an advocacy realm. They do lots of different things, and all of them talked about, you know, how bored they were during this pandemic. And I'm like, brother, you should enter into our line of work, because this was the craziest couple months that I've ever seen. I'd like to pick the three of your brains, and kind of anybody who wants to answer this, I'm okay with. What are you worried about from a budget or public policy perspective coming out of the pandemic, when we do come out of it, for as it affects the real estate industry? My antennae are up about property taxes. I don't know if I'm being too cautious, but I worry about the budget shortfalls that our counties and our cities are seeing. And I'm watching those agenda items very closely for that. So for the panel, anybody who wants to jump in, what do you think about what's coming? Barb, looks like you're ready to go.
Okay, well, I didn't want to jump in. You know, we already have a sales tax increase on the ballot for one of the cities that I cover. I think all of the cities are struggling with revenue. Even the mighty Weld County, that has always done so well with oil and gas revenues, is now facing issues there. And I think you're absolutely right, Nick. We'd better be watching things like property taxes, because governments will be desperate for funding, and it's easy to look at property and property tax as something that can always be further taxed to pay for those services that now governments are finding themselves struggling to pay for.
Absolutely. Peter, Clarissa, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say property taxes for sure. That's even in some of the offline discussions. And I say offline loosely because right now through the internet, you can watch pretty much any local governing authorities meetings, and you can see what they're talking off the record. And so property tax increase has already been thrown out by the Board of County Commissioners in El Paso County. And to what extent? It's obviously just a notion, but today's briefing and the informal city council meeting is they're going to be yet again asking for a Tabor retention. And so they're wanting, because, you know, Colorado Springs always has been pretty prudent about asking their voters and doing the exact number crunching to say, hey, we would like to retain X amount of dollars from this budget in order to be able to pay for these projects. Well, today's exercise was just that. They're projecting what the shortfall is going to be. And right now they're fine. They're saying that they're fine for the remainder of the 2020 cycle. But while we're seeing what's happening around the country for defunding the police, Colorado Springs is actually looking at allocating additional resources to safety, public safety. And so they are going to be asking the voters for a budget retention, you know, in order to be able to foot the bill for public safety and other services. And those other services have yet to be discussed. But when you're doing that at the city of Colorado Springs level, and this is for November, and then Board of County Commissioners is talking about, hey, it's taboo, but we might have to be looking at property tax increases. And then they're going to be looking, obviously, should Gallagher pass, it's how things end up being rebalanced. And so all these different things are going to be impacting not only at the state level, but they trickle down to the local level. And we have to look at school boards and all these different, you know, elements. And so we're already seeping through all the conversation that's building up. And that's going to be an issue of contention. And it might come down to the fact that we can't say no. It's how do you balance the equation knowing what the communities are going to be faced with?
Yeah. Absolutely. And Peter, as I come to you, you know, by no means are any of us saying that property taxes are a bad thing. We love the way our counties when they're in school boards and taxing districts are judicious with property taxes, but we all guard against that line of affordability of home ownership versus services that you get for the taxes you pay for. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo again, property taxes. It's always a revenue stream that's concerning for us who want home ownership to be as affordable as possible. I think the most concerning thing for me is direct democracy. And so what I mean by that is the ability for citizens to put initiatives on the ballot, and the fact that the bar for them to be able to do so is extremely low. What I'm not saying is that it's not necessarily a good thing for citizens to be able to access the ballot and put initiatives on there if they want to, especially if their local elected officials are not necessarily moving in the right direction and kind of listening and taking a pulse to their community. But we've dealt with some issues over the past few years that are, short-sighted. Green Roofs Initiative, for example, was one that was frankly not even burdensome on the typical residential property owner, but typically some of our bigger multi-family buildings that would have increased costs there. But at the end of the day, the initiative that the proponents came up with didn't actually address the problem very well, but it had a lot of unintended consequences. So we spent 8 months after that thing passed with a task force creating a proposal that actually would get at what the proponents wanted and provide some more flexibility for property owners. So, and we also face the same thing. It's not going to end up being on this November's ballot, but the same proponents of the Green Roofs Initiative, gathered a few thousand signatures again in the city and county of Denver. And we're looking to put a carbon tax on this year's ballot, which is a tax on everyone's electricity and natural gas. Obviously, that makes housing more expensive. Oh, and by the way, there weren't a lot of exemptions for low-income homeowners, which was obviously problematic in itself. So the ability for some of these individuals to qualify for the ballot so easily and not actually think through some of the unintended consequences of their initiatives is problematic. And I think, smart elected officials probably understand the tea leaves in terms of a property tax. The likelihood of one is pretty low in passing, especially with where we are right now with COVID. But some of these, activist citizens don't know any better. And you ultimately are fighting something that may be viable, maybe not, but they could start looking at property taxes and some of those other needs that increase the cost of housing as a way to fund some of their projects.
Yeah. Another interesting one that our colleagues in Aurora have brought up in chat, and I think all four of us have heard about, is Aurora's considering a vacancy tax to tax at a particular level. I didn't really read the proposal, but about taxing landlords that have vacancies available as a means of generating revenue. So without knowing the actual particulars of that, I think it's interesting that all of us across the state will be watching creative and interesting ideas to make up for the budget shortfalls of this. I would like to pick your brains for a moment. We're about 12 minutes left in this, and Cameron's going to finish us with an RPAC question. I'd like to get your perspective on attitudes of the electorates this November. None of us are really facing a lot of local elections, a couple ballot measures here and there. There are obviously a lot of statewide elections and a national election. So even though we're not talking about local issues, would you each give me a minute or so, maybe 2 minutes, on what you're gleaning from the attitudes of the electorate that you're seeing through all of this? I think Clarissa hasn't gone first.
Well, all I can say is that, I'm more qualitative than quantitative. And when I talk to people within our community and our realtor members, I like to figure out where they stand on things, much more so than what the numbers tell us. And I think that this is more of a general discussion about where people are. Their attitude does not necessarily translate to what the polling questions are being thrown out there. And so there's two different sets of things going on. You have polls that people talk about at the national level, but that's really not what the local communities, that's Main Street America. And so we can focus on whatever the national projections are, or we can see what the talk in our communities is, which is about the local issues. What things matter to people on Main Street America. And communities across the country, and I can't speak for Denver, I can't speak for County or any of the ones that you guys represent. I can speak to what El Paso County and Teller County stand for. And so we have people that don't necessarily want to speak up about what our communities are facing politically. And so that's one level of discussion. They want to make sure that their jobs are protected, that economic development is happening because it employs people within our communities, that there's skill sets that are matching up to the jobs. And so those are the things that we see, not only from our economic development perspective in Colorado Springs, but throughout. They're worried about where their paychecks are going to come from. And so we might be seeing national discussion of a lot of political turmoil, but the Main Street person is more worried about their jobs, their kids at school, things that are being impacted directly right now through COVID. And national discussion is only marginal in comparison to how people affect that the issues in their communities are impacting their well-being. So if I have my tea leaves, there's almost like a disconnect. The more you watch national news, the more you're going to believe what's happening in the national sphere. And if you're out in the community working day to day and communicating with people and listening to people, you're going to find that sentiment is different because people are worried about things that strike at their pocketbooks.
Yeah, absolutely. Peter and Barbara, you're both on mute. Take yourself on mute and give us a little perspective.
Yeah, so in Denver, I guess the way that I'll talk about kind of gauging where Denver residents are is we're going to have a couple of ballot initiatives that are on the ballot this November, one of which is going to be for a sales tax increase of 0.25%, which is pretty significant. And it's going to be funding homelessness, particularly housing and mental health services. Denver voters just a year and a half ago approved another 0.25% sales tax increase to fund mental health services. So this is going to piggyback on that one. I'm polling for that. That referred measure is looking good. And there's also going to be another referred measure, which is another sales tax increase of 0.25%, which is going to be addressing and creating dollars for climate change. We worked on that climate carbon tax proposal that I brought up earlier. The trade-off of removing that from the ballot was to put a sales tax increase on the ballot because it was going to be less impactful to lower income individuals. Not to say there's not an impact, there is, but at the end of the day, it was going to be less impactful. Polling for that one is good as well. So I guess the long and the short of it is, even though we're in tough times and folks are, plenty of them are in tough times financially, there's still a willingness on certain issues such as climate, housing, homelessness, particularly in the city and county of Denver, for the voters to approve these kind of measures on top of just a couple of years ago when they already approved 4 additional sales tax increases. So that seems to be the means to generate dollars and cents in the city and not property tax, which is good, but that's really where our folks are at right now.
Barb?
Well, there's a reason I think that I am not involved in advocacy at the federal level. That's just way too crazy for my brain. That being said, of course, I follow what's going on in DC. I think that the presidential election will still certainly affect local voters. I think we'll see a bigger turnout because of it, as we always do. Although I think people are focused on their local issues and local needs, the economy being foremost, the connection comes when they look at who they'll vote for president, because of course they're going to try to pick the candidate they think will make the economy more favorable for their community and take care of their community, which are not always the same, right? There are different issues at stake there. I think it will be really interesting this time. 4 years ago, I completely missed it with my projections about things, like most of us. I now have completely lost my confidence in trying to predict presidential elections, not that I ever claimed to be an expert. So it's hard to say, but I hope that people's focus on their families and themselves and their jobs does not prevent them from educating themselves about the different candidates, whether it's county commissioner, whether it's the Senate race, whether it's the president. They need, my frustration as a a person who follows public policy is how uninterested people often are in really looking at candidates and vetting them and trying to figure out who is the best candidate in their opinion. People just, they may watch the news and see all the hoo-ha going on in Washington, but that doesn't mean they're an educated voter. And I think our members do much better at that by and large. And I just want to encourage everybody watching this to make sure that they do educate themselves and that they do vote, because there's nothing on this good earth that makes me sadder than people that just don't bother to vote.
Absolutely.
I don't get it.
And our members should probably be contributing to RPAC as well. Cameron, is that correct?
Yeah, that's the hope for sure. Are you ready for me to go into the RPAC? I know we've only got 5 minutes or so left here, so I can do that if you want. So you've heard all this this amazing information from our amazing GADs from all over the state, and we are here celebrating RPAC month. So I do just have a quick RPAC related question, and before I go into that, as everyone knows, RPAC, the Realtors Political Action Committee, it helps elect realtor champions at the local, state, and national level. And the more realtor champions that we can have in office, the easier our GADs can advocate on your behalf. So we'd love to have anyone invest. I'm going to go ahead and show you the slide there, so you guys can, everyone can see. If you do want to invest, here is a link and information around our diamond drawing, but also I will send a follow-up email. But what my question is about RPAC is, how have you adapted your RPAC fundraising in response to the COVID-19 pandemic? And in addition to that, how do you think this will change your approach to fundraising in the long term? So, whoever wants to start, go for it.
Great. I want to give an answer for once in this hour. So, and I'll summarize, and I bet my colleagues aren't too far off. It has been very difficult to directly solicit in these last 4 months when our members are worried about their jobs and their livelihood. So it has been a soft reinforcement of the message, but I do believe that time to ramp up is now. It is time to accentuate the work that the local, state, and national associations have done on behalf of our membership, and the backbone of the relationships that we've all built over years and times is the Realtors Political Action Committee. The boards I represent, the message will now be stronger, and I hope it will be received well, because I truly believe we can't do any of this stuff without RPAC. Colleagues?
No, Nick, I think that's extremely well said. And yeah, to your point, we made a conscious decision at DMAR during the first few months of this pandemic, really not to solicit any investments whatsoever. We didn't think it was appropriate. We frankly thought it was maybe insensitive, especially for those first couple months. People had causes that were really important to them and dollars that they wanted to give, in addition to just getting by themselves. So I do think we're at the point where we can start soliciting investments again. And yeah, I mean, to what you just said, I think the more that we can sit there and put people in office that are supporting, these positive policies for the industry, the better off we're all going to be. Yes, for you and your business, but most importantly, I think we're the fiercest advocate for the consumer, their homes, their nest egg. I mean, obviously, it's the most valuable asset we have, and that's really my pitch when I'm talking to folks about RPAC, whether they're in the realtor associations or not. I mean, we really are the fiercest advocates for the homeowner out there, and I think we need to continue to be. And we can't do that without elected officials in office that are most importantly just pragmatic, reasonable folks that are willing to understand how some of their policies are going to impact the homeowner and the affordability of homeownership.
Barb, go ahead. Anybody? Yep.
Well, I just wanted to echo what you and Peter said. What I always like to say to people is it's a heck of a lot easier to work with an elected official that you've supported and that understands property rights than it is to work with one who has no feeling or support for our issues. And while I think some realtors may think, wow, well, there probably aren't that many of them, I actually know in my communities, there are quite a few. So, you know, we have been very careful about trying to encourage investment in the beginning of this pandemic, but like everybody else, we have to start encouraging people to invest now, even if they can't invest at the level that they previous have. Every dollar that they make, that they donate, makes a difference. And, you know, to think that if every member donated $25, we would all make our goals easily. You know, I go back to that and just remind people that we're not asking them to donate more than they can afford. And it's hard, but, you know, we will never be able to stop advocating for our industry. There are always competing interests and others who don't see real estate as important. And if we don't have our PAC dollars to help support those campaigns, our industry will be in trouble.
Absolutely. Clarissa, last word?
Right. I pretty much echo everything that's been said. And I think that the opportunity has been, because of COVID, our members have seen the importance of advocacy, because we have benefited from folks stepping up their contributions without even us rolling out anything. And they were still trickling in as real estate was deemed essential. So that floored me, which is great. That's what I said. It's a window of opportunity. But because of COVID, people have seen how great and how beneficial advocacy is to the industry.
Absolutely. Absolutely. As we finish up, I want to thank our panelists, because I continue to learn from all three of you. And Cameron, this was fun, actually. I would like to investigate.
It was fun.
Again.
Let's do it again.
Thank you. Yeah, I echo that. I thank all three of our panelists, our amazing local GADs, Nick for moderating, who is also an amazing local GAD. And I agree, I think this was great. A lot of information. So I'll definitely think about how we can do this again soon. And also thank everybody for joining. You can see the details here, and I will send everybody a follow-up email. And this also has been recorded. So if one of your colleagues would like to watch it, just let me know. And we really appreciate everybody. Anything else before we go?
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Good
Thanks,
to see you
everyone.
guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.